In the winter of 1943, deep in the restless waters north of New Guinea, a single American submarine was rewriting every rule the U.S. Navy believed about undersea warfare. USS Wahoo, hull number SS-238, did not stalk the Pacific like her sister boats, slipping silently beneath destroyers, diving at the first hint of danger, striking only when conditions were perfect. Under the command of Lieutenant Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, Wahoo behaved like no submarine Japan or even America had ever seen. She hunted on the surface. She charged instead of fleeing. She attacked with the reckless confidence of a destroyer and the precision of a master marksman. And her crew, hardened by weeks of Morton's uncompromising training, began to believe that they were part of something extraordinary, a submarine that would never back down. Morton had taken command of Wahoo only weeks earlier, yet his influence transformed everything aboard. He broke from the timid doctrine that had plagued the early years of the U.S. submarine campaign. The manual still said the same thing. A submarine, when confronted by a destroyer, must dive immediately, seek safety in depth, then evade with silence and patience. Every new skipper learned it. Every training film emphasized it. Every tactical conference reinforced it. But Morton ignored all of it. His philosophy was simple. The best defense is a torpedo on target. He had seen too many opportunities wasted because American submarines ran instead of fought. If a destroyer charged, Morton reasoned, then the destroyer was presenting its bow, its weakest target profile. Instead of diving, a submarine could fire straight into that bow, disrupt the attack, and seize the initiative. It was a theory so aggressive, so counter to Navy thinking, that most submarine officers dismissed it as suicidal. But Morton believed it, and on Wahoo, belief became doctrine. By late January 1943, Wahoo was in the middle of her third war patrol, cruising off Wewak on the north coast of New Guinea. Intelligence had reported heavy Japanese transport traffic supplying army units positioned along the coast. Morton intended to intercept these convoys and cripple the flow of men and supplies heading toward the front. On the evening of January 23rd, Wahoo sighted a Japanese troop transport under the cover of dusk. Morton maneuvered skillfully, firing 3 torpedoes and sending the ship to the bottom in minutes. The crew barely had time to celebrate. Morton knew a destroyer escort must be close by. Japanese doctrine was clear. Whenever a transport was hit, its escorts would close in aggressively. Wahoo remained on the surface, charging into darkness as the thunder of depth charges echoed distantly across the sea. At dawn the next morning, January 24, 1943, the lookouts on Wahoo spotted the unmistakable silhouette of a Japanese destroyer rushing toward them. Through binoculars, the crew identified her as Hiroshima, a Shiratsuyu-class destroyer armed with depth charges, 5-inch guns, and torpedoes. She was fast, dangerous, and, most importantly, charging straight at them. The standard U.S. Navy response was automatic: dive. But standing on the conning tower, Morton did not give the order. He stared at the oncoming destroyer, closed the binoculars, and shouted instead, "We're holding course." For the crew, this was the moment they realized the Wahoo they served on was unlike any submarine afloat. They had heard rumors of Morton's aggressive theories, heard him discuss them during briefings, but now, right here, as a destroyer bore down on them, they saw him put those theories into action. To dive now would be safe, conventional, predictable. But diving also meant surrendering the initiative, giving Hiroshima time to maneuver and hammer Wahoo with depth charges. Morton wanted the opposite. He wanted Hiroshima off balance, forced into evasive action, forced to react rather than attack. He wanted to fight. As Hiroshima closed the distance, the Japanese crew also experienced their first wave of confusion. They expected the American submarine to disappear beneath the surface. Instead, Wahoo held steady at periscope depth, her mast slicing the waves like a shark's fin. To Hiroshima's officers, this behavior appeared almost insane. Every Japanese anti-submarine lesson emphasized the same pattern. The enemy dives, then the destroyer hunts. But Wahoo did not dive. She came closer. Inside the submarine, Morton ordered the torpedo room to stand by for a bow shot. The destroyer was presenting its nose directly toward Wahoo, a shape that made conventional targeting difficult. But Morton wasn't attempting a conventional shot. He was attempting a down-the-throat shot, firing a torpedo straight into the center line of an onrushing warship. No American manual endorsed this tactic. Most officers believed it was impossible. But Morton believed it, and on Wahoo, belief became doctrine. The stage was set for one of the most daring torpedo attacks in submarine history, a moment when an American submarine, instead of fleeing from a Japanese destroyer, turned toward it like a duelist drawing his weapon. The crew did not yet know it, but in the next seconds, Morton would shatter decades of submarine doctrine and launch the shot that changed the identity of the U.S. submarine force. As Harusame thundered toward Wahoo through the morning haze of January 24, 1943, every instinct drilled into American submariners screamed for the same response: blow negative tanks, dive hard, level off deep, and slip away before the destroyer could unleash its depth charges. That was the formula, the method, the doctrine practiced at New London, Pearl Harbor, and Fremantle. But aboard Wahoo, doctrine had no hold on the man standing at the periscope. Morton kept his eyes fixed on the zigzagging profile of the Japanese destroyer as it closed the distance, the bow wave rising higher, the hull slicing through the sea like a blade. Instead of ordering a dive, he barked commands that pushed Wahoo faster, steadier, directly into the attacker's path. A submarine was not meant to behave this way. Inside the cramped control room, the crew grappled with a mixture of fear, disbelief, and unwilling admiration. Morton's executive officer, Lieutenant Richard O'Kane, understood better than most what was happening. Morton did not want to survive the encounter by evasion. He wanted to win it by overwhelming aggression. O'Kane would later become a legendary submarine commander in his own right, but in this moment, he was watching the birth of the doctrine he would carry into his own command: attack, never retreat, seize the initiative. The destroyer continued its charge. The hydrophone operator, drenched in sweat, called out rapid bearing changes. Harusame's shrews roared through the sound gear with a ferocity that made the deck plates vibrate. She was coming fast, faster than any transport, faster than any escort Wahoo had ever faced. Japanese destroyer crews were trained to kill submarines with unrelenting precision, close rapidly, force the submarine down, drop depth charges in patterned runs, and circle the search area, repeat until nothing moved. Yet Harusame's crew was witnessing something they had never been trained to expect: a submarine that refused to submerge. On Harusame's bridge, officers peered through binoculars, expecting at any second to lose sight of Wahoo's periscope wake. Instead, the wake stayed. Then it grew clearer. Then it grew closer. At first, they assumed Wahoo was malfunctioning, unable to dive. Then, with a ripple of confusion spreading across the bridge like panic in a crowded room, they realized the horrifying truth. The American submarine was charging them. Destroyer crews had a word for torpedo attacks from the front: shomen kogeki, a frontal assault. But such attacks always came from surface torpedo boats or aircraft, never from submarines. Submarines were supposed to run. Submarines were prey, not predators. Back aboard Wahoo, Morton's voice cut through the tension like a cold steel blade. Stand by, fire control, give me final solution. The fire control team scrambled to adjust settings. A down-the-throat shot required perfect alignment. The destroyer's bow presented the smallest possible target area, and the torpedo had to strike before the destroyer could veer off or deploy countermeasures. If the torpedo ran too deep, it would pass harmlessly under Harusame's keel. If it ran too shallow, it would impact the armored stem without enough force to cripple the ship. And if the range shortened too fast, if Morton waited even 1 second too long, Harusame would ram them. Men clung to pipes, to bulkheads, to the overhead, bracing themselves as Wahoo surged forward in defiance of everything the silence doctrine had taught them. Only Morton stood tall, hands poised on the periscope grips, calling out angle on the bow readings with calm, clipped precision. He looked like a man steering his ship into destiny. At 1,800 yards, Harusame opened fire.
Shell splashes erupted near Wahoo's periscope, geysers of white foam crashing back onto the sea. The concussion shook the submarine. Officers on the bridge of Harusame screamed orders, their guns trying desperately to find the submarine's exact location. But Wahoo's low silhouette and erratic speed changes made a clean shot nearly impossible. Morton ignored the shells. He watched the bow of the destroyer fill his lens until it became a wall of steel, surging closer and closer, the rising spray lashing across the forward deck of the Japanese ship. The tension inside Wahoo reached its peak. Every man now understood that their fate depended on one shot. If Morton was wrong, they would be dead within minutes. Steady, steady. Range decreasing fast, destroyer bearing constant, O'Kane shouted. Stand by. Harusane was seconds away from optimal depth charge release distance. 2 more seconds, and she would be too close for Wahoo to escape, even if Morton ordered an emergency dive. This was it. The moment. The razor's edge between brilliance and annihilation. Fire 1. The torpedo shot out with a violent hiss, the entire submarine shuddering as the compressed air system expelled the fish into the sea. Morton immediately ordered a hard turn to port to bring Wahoo out of Harusame's direct line of travel. The destroyer, seeing the sudden maneuver, attempted to adjust course, but her bow was committed. Momentum and speed locked her into a trajectory she could no longer escape. Inside Harusame's forward compartments, lookouts screamed warnings as they spotted the telltale white wake of a torpedo heading straight for them. Japanese training emphasized evasive action, but no destroyer could change course sharply enough while charging at full speed. Their own momentum now became their doom. On Wahoo's bridge, Morton's voice cut through the tension like a cold steel blade. Steady, steady. Range decreasing fast, destroyer bearing constant, O'Kane shouted. Stand by. Harusame was seconds away from optimal depth charge release distance. 2 more seconds, and she would be too close for Wahoo to escape, even if Morton ordered an emergency dive. This was it. The moment. The razor's edge between brilliance and annihilation. Fire 1. The torpedo shot out with a violent hiss, the entire submarine shuddering as the compressed air system expelled the fish into the sea. Morton immediately ordered a hard turn to port to bring Wahoo out of Harusame's direct line of travel. The destroyer, seeing the sudden maneuver, attempted to adjust course, but her bow was committed. Momentum and speed locked her into a trajectory she could no longer escape. Inside Harusame's forward compartments, lookouts screamed warnings as they spotted the telltale white wake of a torpedo heading straight for them. Japanese training emphasized evasive action, but no destroyer could change course sharply enough while charging at full speed. Their own momentum now became their doom. On Wahoo's bridge, Morton watched the torpedo run, carefully timing the destroyer's close. The torpedo wake sliced closer and closer to Harusame's bow. For a single heartbeat, the sea went silent. Then the explosion erupted. A violent plume shot upward at the destroyer's stem, sending steel fragments and seawater bursting into the air. Harusame lurched hard, her bow buckling under the impact. The charge was not enough to sink her, but it shattered the destroyer's attack run. Instead of closing in for the kill, Harusame was forced to break off, bleeding speed, smoke rising from her damaged forward sections. The unthinkable had happened. A submarine had stopped a charging destroyer by attacking head-on. And as Wahoo slipped away to set up her next attack, the crew realized they had just witnessed the birth of a new kind of submarine warfare, one not shaped by manuals or traditions, but by the audacity of a commander who refused to run from anything.
When the shock wave of the torpedo blast rippled across the surface, echoing through Wahoo's hull like a deep metallic roar, every man aboard the submarine understood instantly that they had just survived an encounter no American submarine was ever meant to endure. But survival was only part of it. What Morton had just accomplished, a perfectly executed down-the-throat shot against a charging destroyer, was something no U.S. Navy tactical manual had even dared to imagine. It was more than a victory. It was a declaration of a new doctrine, a violent birth of aggressive submarine warfare in the Pacific. Yet for several 10 seconds after the explosion, Wahoo's crew did not celebrate. They did not cheer. They waited. Trained by harsh experience, they knew Japanese destroyers often pressed their attack even when damaged. Some ships could continue depth charge runs for several minutes after losing power, and Harasame, though staggered, was still afloat. Morton kept Wahoo shallow, refusing to dive deep. Most submarine commanders would have taken the destroyer's momentary confusion as a chance to escape into the depths, but Morton had no intention of running. "Keep her at periscope depth," he ordered, calmly, scanning the surface as Harasame struggled to regain control. Wahoo's bow angled slightly as she completed her evasive turn, and Morton pivoted the scope to track the destroyer. She was listing forward, spray washing over her damaged bow as she reduced speed. It was enough, more than enough, to buy Morton time to reset his attack posture. Inside the boat, adrenaline surged through the passageways. The torpedo room crew scrambled to ready the remaining tubes. Men wiped sweat from their palms, checked depth settings, and relayed readiness reports to the control room. They worked with a speed that came not from panic, but from the electrifying realization that their skipper had just proven the impossible was possible. On Harasame, the scene was chaos. The forward compartments were flooded. The sudden loss of buoyancy forced the bow down. Damage control teams rushed to seal bulkheads. Officers shouted for evasive action. The destroyer's sonar operators, disoriented by the concussion, struggled to reacquire the submarine. But the truth was unmistakable. Harasame had been forced out of attack position by a single American torpedo. Morton saw all of it through the periscope, and in that moment, he made a choice that would forever change submarine tactics. Instead of slipping away, he prepared for a second strike. The hunting mindset had returned. Wahoo was no longer the prey, she was the predator. "Come right, steady, set up for stern tubes," Morton ordered. O'Kane acknowledged, adjusting the submarine's angle and speed with precise, practiced movements. The crew barely breathed as Wahoo maneuvered behind the damaged destroyer. Most skippers would have taken comfort in merely escaping a destroyer attack. Morton wanted more. As Wahoo prepared for the follow-up shot, Harasame's officers finally recognized the danger. They attempted to turn broadside to unleash their guns, but the damage to the bow made steering sluggish and uneven. A ship that depended on speed for survival had been robbed of the one trait that made her deadly. And all of it, every second of delay, was caused by a submarine that should have been diving for its life, not stalking for a second kill. Morton didn't get that second shot. Harasame, though damaged, managed to slip into a smokescreen and limp away. But the strategic outcome was undeniable. Wahoo had neutralized a major threat and preserved her ability to strike the Japanese convoy. Within minutes, Morton was already directing the boat toward fresh targets. What mattered was not whether Harasame sank, it was that Wahoo had broken the destroyer's attack run by sheer audaciousness. Word of the engagement would not reach Pearl Harbor until weeks later when Wahoo returned from patrol. But among the crew, the legend formed instantly. This was the moment they realized that Morton's theories were not madness, they were genius. The official patrol report filed by Morton would later describe the event with cool professionalism, but between the lines, anyone reading it could sense the magnitude of what had happened. A U.S. submarine had stood its ground and won. When Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Submarine Force Pacific, read the report, he was stunned. He called it one of the bravest and most skillful attacks ever executed by a submarine. Other submarine skippers read it with equal parts disbelief and admiration. Many had lost boats by following outdated doctrine. Morton had rewritten the doctrine entirely. And then came the ripple effect, the transformation of the entire Pacific submarine force. Skippers who once avoided confrontation began to emulate Morton's aggression. Tactics shifted, training evolved. The idea that a submarine must always dive in the face of danger faded into history.
Officers like Richard O'Kane, who learned under Morton's command, carried the philosophy into their own commands, leading to some of the most successful patrols in submarine history. As for the Japanese Navy, the psychological damage was real. Harusame's crew reported the encounter to their superiors in disbelief. The American submarine attacked us. Not fled, attacked. Destroyer captains across the Imperial Navy began to understand that the enemy beneath the waves was no longer predictable. The old playbook, charge, force a dive, deliver depth charges, no longer guaranteed safety. Now, every approach to a submarine carried the risk of a torpedo aimed directly down their throat. What Morton and Wahoo demonstrated that day was more than courage. It was a complete reframing of submarine warfare. From that moment on, American submarines would hunt with a predatory mindset, proving that aggression, not evasion, was the key to dominating Japan's sea lanes.
When Harusame limped away, trailing smoke and bow spray, the crew of Wahoo finally allowed themselves to breathe again, but their commander did not. Morton stood firm at the periscope, scanning the diminishing silhouette of the destroyer with the same predatory stillness he had shown before the shot. He was looking for any sign that Harusame might turn back, any hint that she might rally for a counterattack. Only when he was certain the destroyer was broken, physically and psychologically, did he turn from the scope and issue the next orders. He did not congratulate the crew. He did not revel in what they had achieved. Instead, he spoke a sentence that would become part of submarine lore. "We're not done. There are more targets ahead." And with that, Wahoo surged forward, leaving behind the stunned destroyer and accelerating toward the Japanese convoy that the escort had been protecting. This transition, from surviving a destroyer charge to immediately resuming offensive operations, was what truly separated Morton from his contemporaries. Most skippers would have been shaken by the near-death encounter, diving deep to catch their breath. But Morton wanted momentum. He believed fear was the enemy of initiative, and initiative was the soul of submarine warfare. Within hours, Wahoo located additional ships. The crew, still electrified from the confrontation with Harusame, worked with sharpened focus. They loaded torpedoes with reverence, as if preparing weapons for a ritual rather than a battle. Every man understood now, more than ever, that Morton's tactics demanded precision and unrelenting aggression. They had lived through the unimaginable. They knew the submarine could triumph through sheer will and skill. Reports from Wahoo's subsequent attacks during this patrol show a clear pattern. Morton was no longer experimenting with aggressive tactics. He was perfecting them. He pursued ships relentlessly, firing spreads at bold angles, attacking at night on the surface, performing submerged daylight strikes without hesitation. The encounter with Harusame had crystallized something inside him. He had proven to himself and to the entire submarine force that the old doctrine was dead. As Wahoo shattered supply lines along the New Guinea coast, the reverberations of her earlier engagement spread through Japanese naval communications. Harusame's damage report described the incident with astonishment, highlighting the extraordinary aggressiveness of the American submarine. Japanese commanders, accustomed to predictable, evasive American subs, registered this change with deep unease. A charging submarine was an anomaly. A charging submarine that could cripple a destroyer was a nightmare. In Tokyo, staff officers in the Imperial Navy's anti-submarine division reviewed intercepted reports with growing concern. They began issuing warnings to destroyer flotillas. American submarines may perform unexpected frontal attacks, exercise caution during approach runs. This single line, added quietly to revised doctrine, signaled a dramatic shift in how Japan perceived the threat beneath the Pacific waves. Submarines were no longer passive hunters. They were ambush predators, capable of turning on their attackers with terrifying speed. Meanwhile, halfway across the ocean in Pearl Harbor, the Wahoo's patrol report landed on Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood's desk. Lockwood, who had long believed his submarine captains were held back by outdated rules and inadequate torpedo design, read Morton's narrative with a mixture of shock and admiration. He shared the account with other submarine commanders, pointing to Morton as the model for what American submarine warfare needed to become: assertive, adoptive, fearless. O'Kane, who served beside Morton during the Harusame engagement, absorbed these lessons with intensity. He saw firsthand how boldness could turn the tide, how initiative could neutralize even a superior surface ship. In later years, O'Kane would use these principles aboard USS Tang, executing daring attacks that would make him one of the most successful submarine commanders of the war. In many ways, Tang's later triumphs were born on the morning Wahoo faced Harusame. For the man of Wahoo, the aftermath of the encounter was transformative. Survivors' memoirs and oral histories revealed that the moment Harusame broke off its attack became a turning point, not just for their patrol, but for their belief in their commander and their vessel. A submarine crew lives and dies based on trust. Trust in the boat, trust in the equipment, and above all, trust in the skipper. After the Harusame incident, that trust became absolute. When Morton issued an order, no matter how unconventional, the crew obeyed instantly. He had shown them that boldness was victory. As Wahoo completed her patrol and prepared to return to base, word of her feats traveled ahead of her. Radio men who monitored encrypted traffic whispered of a submarine that had charged a destroyer. Submarine tenders in Pearl Harbor anticipated her arrival with curiosity. Younger officers gathered on docks, waiting to shake hands with the crew who had lived through something unprecedented. When Wahoo finally sailed into Pearl Harbor, her hull marked by the scars of the patrol, a crowd gathered to greet her. They were not merely welcoming a returning boat, they were welcoming a legend. But beneath the admiration lay something more powerful, a shift in mindset. The U.S. submarine force, once restrained by conservative doctrine, now had proof that audacity worked, that initiative beat caution, that a submarine could dominate even the most formidable enemy ships if commanded with vision and courage. This was the true aftermath of the Harusame encounter, not the damaged destroyer, not even the tactical innovation. It was the psychological transformation of an entire community of submariners who would go on to wage the most devastating undersea campaign in naval history. And all of it, every torpedo fired in newfound confidence, every aggressive surface attack, every bold infiltration, could trace its lineage back to one moment in January 1943 when an American submarine refused to dive. Wahoo had changed the war. Morton had changed the submarine force. And the Japanese destroyer crews, who once believed they knew how submarines would behave, suddenly realized they were facing a new kind of enemy, one that charged instead of fled. By the time Wahoo returned from her January 1943 patrol, the story of her confrontation with the destroyer Harusame had already begun spreading through both the American submarine force and the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Yet the full meaning of that moment, the charge, the down-the-throat shot, the refusal to dive, would take months to settle into the consciousness of the Pacific War. It was not merely a daring attack. It was the first glimpse of a transformation underway, a shift that would shape the entire remaining course of undersea warfare in the Pacific. Wahoo had shown the Allies and the Axis alike that a submarine could be more than a predator lurking in the depths. Under a commander like Morton, it could become a knife fighter, a raider, an attacker who chose when and how the battle would unfold. For Japan, the psychological impact was immediate and unsettling. Their destroyer captains were trained on the assumption that American submarines would behave defensively. U.S. doctrine had been predictable: dive deep, evade, lay low. Harusame's encounter shattered that pattern.
Word spread through Japanese anti-submarine circles that some American commanders were now willing, eager even, to counterattack at point-blank range. Suddenly, the destroyers tasked with hunting submarines found themselves forced to consider an unearning possibility. Charging toward a periscope wake might invite a torpedo straight into their bow. This doubt, small but corrosive, began affecting the aggressiveness of Japanese destroyer crews. Moments that once demanded boldness now required hesitation, and hesitation is death in naval warfare. Meanwhile, within the U.S. submarine force, Morton's actions ignited a revolution. Before Wahoo's patrol, doubts and restraint had held back many American skippers. Torpedo failures, conservative training, and fear of destroyer screens had produced a force that was technically capable, but tactically timid. Morton shattered that timidity. His patrol report, clinical in its language but incendiary in implication, became required reading for aggressive young officers. When Lockwood circulated the account among submarine commanders, the message was unmistakable. Boldness is not recklessness. Boldness is a weapon. Emerging leaders like Richard O'Kane, Slade Cutter, Sam Dealey, and Eugene Fluckey absorbed these lessons deeply. They would go on to execute equally daring attacks, down-the-throat shots, nighttime surface charges, high-speed end-around maneuvers, and operations inside narrow straits thought impassable. Wahoo's confrontation with Harusame was the spark that lit the fuse. The explosion that followed came in 1944 and 1945, when American submarines destroyed over half of the Japanese merchant fleet and choked the empire's industrial lifelines to death. But Wahoo's legacy was not merely tactical, it was human, etched into the memories of the men who served under Morton. Survivors wrote years later that no moment changed them more than the sight of Harusame rushing toward them, the deck guns flashing, and Morton refusing to order a dive. They felt the submarine shudder beneath their feet as they raced forward instead of down. They heard Morton's steady voice cutting through the rising fear. They saw a torpedo streak into the destroyer that everyone believed would kill them. That moment bonded them permanently, turning a crew into a legend. Morton himself became a mythic figure within months. When Wahoo returned from successive patrols, each more aggressive than the last, his reputation outgrew even the boat. Newspapers called him a submarine daredevil. Japanese intelligence reports referred to Wahoo as the most dangerous American submarine. His name carried weight far beyond the submarine community. He embodied the shift from caution to ferocity that would define the U.S. Navy's undersea war. Tragically, that ferocity carried a price. In October 1943, Wahoo disappeared in the Sea of Japan. Post-war Japanese records revealed she had been sunk by shore-based aircraft after a series of daring attacks inside enemy-controlled waters. Morton and his crew were lost with the vessel they had turned into a symbol of defiance. The news stunned the submarine force. Some wondered whether his risk-taking had finally gone too far. But even those who questioned his methods never questioned his impact. Without his aggression, the submarine campaign might never have become the decisive force it ultimately was. And yet, Wahoo's destruction did not erase her legacy. It crystallized it. Her earlier patrols became sacred stories within the submarine fleet. Young officers quoted Morton's lines. Veterans taught new recruits the doctrine he had invented through instinct and courage. The courage to attack, not evade. The courage to seize the initiative even when the odds screamed retreat. The courage to meet a charging destroyer with a charging submarine. In the years after the war, naval historians studied the Harusame encounter with awe. It represented a turning point not because it alone changed strategy, but because it symbolizes the moment American submariners began fighting the war they needed to fight, not the war they had been trained for. Even the Japanese acknowledged this change. A surviving officer from a different destroyer later wrote in his memoir, "After Wahoo, we feared the American submarines. They no longer behaved like prey." And perhaps that is the clearest legacy of Morton's infamous charge. In one bold, impossible moment, Wahoo forced the Imperial Japanese Navy to rethink what it believed about submarine warfare. It forced the U.S. Navy to rewrite its tactical doctrine. And it forced the world to recognize that the Pacific's deadliest hunters were no longer the ones on the surface, but the ones willing to confront danger head-on from beneath the waves. Morton did not live to see that truth realized across the Pacific, but every submarine that stalked a convoy, every destroyer that hesitated before charging a periscope wake, every torpedo fired in defiance of the old rules, carried forward the legacy born on January 24, 1943. A legacy forged in a single impossible choice. Don't dive, charge.